Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we embark on a journey of love, sacrifice, and self-discovery. Meet Emma Montgomery, a woman trapped in a world of duty and expectations, controlled by her powerful father's ambitions. But when life takes a dramatic turn, Emma is forced into a marriage that will change everything. As she faces betrayal, fear, and a man who seems to own her, she begins to discover something far deeper: freedom, tenderness, and the kind of love she never thought possible. Stay tuned as we dive into this emotional journey of transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to start today's story. My life had always felt like a carefully constructed facade. I had been raised in a world where perfection was expected, and every move I made was scrutinized under the weight of my family's legacy. I was Emma Montgomery, the only daughter of Senator William Montgomery. To the outside world, I appeared to have it all: the perfect upbringing, the right connections, the beauty and grace that made me the ideal image of what a young woman should be. But behind closed doors, I was nothing more than a puppet, tied to strings of duty, obligation, and the relentless ambitions of a man who cared more about his power than his daughter's happiness. I remember the days that bled into each other, one indistinguishable from the next. I lived in a mansion in Washington, D.C., a towering structure of marble and glass. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it was also cold, sterile, and empty. My every breath was controlled. Every smile, every word, every glance, carefully calibrated to maintain the image of the perfect Montgomery family. I was raised to be a lady, to be poised and flawless, a pristine pearl, as my father often described me. My life had been mapped out long before I could even understand the weight of the decisions that were being made for me. By the time I was 23, I had never known a man's touch, never been kissed, never even dreamed of the possibility of freedom. The world outside those walls seemed like a distant dream, a world where people could live on their own terms, with choices and desires of their own. But that world was as far from me as the stars themselves. My life had been meticulously planned from the start, and I had never dared to defy it. Until that day. It started with my father's voice, trembling in a way I had never heard before. He walked into my room, his usually confident face now pale and hollow. His eyes, once sharp with purpose, were clouded with dread. I could sense the weight of his words before they even left his lips. "You're getting married, Emma," he said, his voice strained. "We have no choice." I felt my stomach twist in knots, and I stared at him, waiting for an explanation. But I already knew. I had been trained to read between the lines, to understand the unspoken truths that hung in the air like thick smoke. His political empire was crumbling, and everything he had worked for, his power, his reputation, his allies, had turned to dust. My father's fall from grace had been swift and brutal. His name was tainted, and the debts that had been quietly accumulating over the years now loomed over him like a guillotine, threatening to cut him down once and for all. And I was his last asset, the last thing he could trade to save himself. The man he had chosen for me was not a noble gentleman, nor even a distant stranger. No, it was Hunter Reed, an infamous businessman, a ruthless player in the corporate world. I had heard of him. His name sent chills down the spines of the most powerful men in the country. He was known for bending the world to his will with money, power, and an unrelenting ambition that drove him to take whatever he wanted, no matter the cost. Hunter Reed was a predator, a man who didn't just own companies. He owned people. To him, I was nothing more than a commodity, something to be acquired and used as he saw fit. My father's words echoed in my mind as I stood there in stunned silence. "Hunter Reed has agreed," he said, his voice hollow. I could see the defeat in his eyes. He couldn't even believe the words he was saying. I had heard of him before, seen his face on the covers of business magazines: dark, piercing eyes, sharp features, and a presence that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. But I had never imagined that one day I would become entangled in his web. Now, I was to be his prize, his possession, his bargaining chip. The wedding was set for the weekend. It would be a cold, clinical event, a mere transaction. A contract signed in black ink. My father's voice trembled as he spoke of it. But there was no room for rebellion. There was no space for pleading. It was already done. And in just a few days, I would cease to exist as Emma Montgomery. I would become Mrs. Hunter Reed. As the days passed, I could feel the walls closing in around me. The gowns, the dresses, the flowers, they all felt foreign. Like pieces of a life that had been imposed upon me. Nothing about that day felt real. No celebration, no joy, no love, only the coldness of a deal made between two men. One desperate, the other in control. I wore a dress I did not choose, spoke vows I did not believe in, and signed my name on a piece of paper that sealed my fate forever. As the ceremony ended, I realized that everything I had once known was slipping away. I was no longer Emma Montgomery, the daughter of a powerful senator. I was now the wife of a man I did not know. A man who did not see me as a person, but as a possession to be owned. The car ride that followed was silent. The world outside blurring past the window. The mansion where Hunter Reed lived loomed in front of me, cold, sleek, and intimidating. It was a fortress made of glass and stone. A stark contrast to the world I had once known. The driver led me into the house. Up to a room that would no longer be mine. The master bedroom, with its imposing bed and dark, silent space, awaited me. It felt like an altar. A place for sacrifice. As the door clicked shut behind me, I knew that my life, as I had known it, was over. The silence in Hunter Reed's mansion felt suffocating. Every corner echoing with my isolation. I had barely entered the master bedroom when I felt the coldness of my new reality settle around me like a heavy, oppressive blanket. The towering walls of glass and steel, which had once seemed impressive and elegant, now felt like a prison. My body was there, but my mind was somewhere else, still clinging to the remnants of a life I could no longer reach. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. Slowly, I turned, and there he stood, Hunter. He shrugged off his jacket, his tie loosening as his gaze raked over me. It was a look of possession, not admiration. His eyes were dark, intense, piercing through me like a blade. A small smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. Did you really think you'd sleep alone tonight? His voice was low, dangerous, sending a chill down my spine. I instinctively took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. But there was nowhere to go. My spine met the cold wall behind me, and I felt trapped. It was like being cornered by a predator. And I knew in that moment there would be no escape. You're my wife, Emma, he said, his voice like velvet, but there was an undeniable edge to it. And I always take what's mine. The words hung in the air like a declaration of ownership. And I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wanted to fight, to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me. Remaining still, Hunter moved closer, slow and deliberate, closing the distance between us. His eyes never left mine. And there was something in them, something dark and commanding, that I couldn't ignore. He was the kind of man who took what he wanted. And he had made it clear that I was no exception. Please, I whispered, my voice trembling, but it was too late for please. His hands were on me before I could protest further, pulling me to him with a force that left no room for resistance. The world around me faded as his presence consumed me. I could feel his breath on my skin, the heat of his body pressing against mine. And despite my fear, a part of me couldn't deny the intensity of the moment. I should have fought, I should have screamed, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, feeling a wave of emptiness wash over me. That night, I lay beside him in his massive, sterile bed, my body exhausted, my mind reeling. It wasn't love, it wasn't even affection, it was control. The next morning, the sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. I was tangled in the sheets, my skin bare, and yet I felt like I was covered in a thick layer of dust. Hunter's presence lingered in the air, but he was gone, as if he had never been there. His scent still clung to my skin, and I shuddered. I should have hated him. I should have despised him for what he had done, for the way he had taken something from me that I had never given freely. And yet, As I lay there in that emptiness, I realized something terrifying. I hadn't fought him. I hadn't pushed him away. Worse still, I had responded to him. The door to the room opened, and Hunter walked in, his hair damp from a shower, his shirt unbuttoned at the top, exposing the hard lines of his chest. His gaze met mine, and I couldn't help but feel exposed under the weight of it. "Did you sleep well?" His voice was teasing, low and deliberate. I pulled the covers tighter around me, wishing I could hide from the emotions churning inside me. "You forced me," I said, my voice small and trembling. Hunter chuckled, a dark, knowing sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He stepped closer, watching me like a predator watching its prey. "Forced you?" he repeated, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Don't lie to me, Emma. You moaned under me. You welcomed me." His words were like a blade, slicing through the fragile walls I had built around myself. I wanted to deny it, wanted to push him away. But the truth was more terrifying than the lies I had told myself. I hadn't fought him. I had let him in. And worse, I had wanted him to. I didn't know what scared me more, the fact that I was being claimed by a man I didn't love or the realization that a part of me was starting to accept it. That night had been a violation. But it had also been the beginning of something else, something I couldn't yet understand. In the days that followed, I found myself drawn to him in ways I couldn't explain. He didn't just dominate my body, he began to dominate my thoughts. But Hunter's possession of me wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological. He seemed to watch me constantly, noticing the smallest details about me, what I liked to eat, how I took my tea, the way I would trace the lines of a book with my fingers. But he wasn't just a tyrant. In his own strange, twisted way, he began to care for me. His gestures weren't about control anymore. They were about tenderness. Every morning, breakfast would be waiting for me, prepared by him. Not the staff. He knew exactly how I liked my tea, how I liked my toast. He had memorized the smallest details about me as if I mattered to him more than anything else. The fear I had felt was still there, but it was mingling with something else, something new. A feeling I didn't want to acknowledge, but couldn't ignore. He wasn't just my captor anymore. He was becoming someone else to me. And though it terrified me, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know more. And just when I thought I had begun to understand him, I realized that I had only scratched the surface of the man I had married. The days began to blur together in a haze of emotions I wasn't prepared to handle. I found myself caught between the man who had claimed me and the part of me that wanted nothing more than to escape. It was a cruel paradox. Part of me hated what I had become, hated what he had forced me into. Yet there was another part of me that was drawn to him, to his presence, to the way he held me in the nights that followed. It wasn't just about control anymore. Something deeper had started to grow between us. Hunter Reed, the man who had initially seemed like a monster, was beginning to reveal a tenderness I hadn't expected. He never let me out of his reach. But it wasn't with the same commanding force. There were moments when I would find him watching me from across the room. A soft look in his eyes that contrasted with the ruthlessness he projected to the outside world. It was confusing, this duality, but in his presence, I felt as though I was part of something greater than myself. There were days when he would care for me in ways I had never experienced. He would prepare my tea in the morning, just the way I liked it, hot but not too hot. The tea leaves steeped to perfection. He knew how I liked my toast, lightly crisped, golden brown with just a hint of butter. It was as though he had memorized my every preference, the smallest details about me. And every morning, when I woke, there would be breakfast, not prepared by the staff, but by his own hands. "You made this yourself?" I asked one morning, my voice filled with surprise as I gazed at the plate in front of me. It felt surreal that this man, this ruthless businessman, had taken the time to prepare something so simple, yet so intimate. He shrugged, a flicker of pride in his dark eyes. "You're my wife. Who else would take better care of you?" It was in the little things. He watched me when I walked through the garden, his eyes following me like a silent guardian. He was always there when I needed him, And even when I didn't, he still found ways to be present, guiding me through my fears. Showing me that maybe, just maybe, I had been wrong about him. I had once thought he only knew how to take. But now I was starting to see a side of him that I hadn't expected. One night, I fell ill, sick with a fever that made my body ache and my head spin. I barely had the energy to get out of bed. But Hunter was there, beside me, never leaving my side. He pressed cool cloths to my burning skin, holding me close as I shivered. His touch, though firm, was gentle, as if my smallest discomfort could destroy him. I should have hated him. I should have wanted to run, to escape from the cage I had found myself in. But as I lay in his arms, weak and vulnerable, I realized that I couldn't. There was something in the way he cared for me, something that reached into the deepest parts of me. It terrified me, this growing connection. I don't want to feel this way, I whispered one night, my voice trembling. I know, he replied softly, brushing my hair from my forehead. But I can't change how I feel. Emma, you're everything to me. His words, though simple, carried the weight of 1,000 emotions. For the first time since we had met, I saw the man who was no longer a predator, but a man who loved deeply and completely. And it was in that moment that I realized something I had been denying for far too long. I was starting to care for him too. But despite the tenderness that began to bloom between us, the fear still lingered in my chest. I was still bound to him in ways I couldn't fully understand. I still wasn't free, and that was something I couldn't ignore. Then, one day, I heard the sound of a phone call. Hunter was tense as he spoke with his lawyer, his voice sharp with frustration. I couldn't hear the entire conversation, but the clipped words he said sent a chill down my spine. What the hell is he doing? His voice was laced with anger. When the call ended, Hunter tossed the phone onto the table. His eyes darkened with something I couldn't read. Your father wants you back, he said coldly. My heart sank. I hadn't heard from my father in weeks. But now, it seemed he was trying to use his lawyers to tear me away from Hunter. His words were a reminder of how everything had begun. My father's grip on my life. His attempts to control me. To use me as a pawn in his own game. I felt a wave of panic rise within me. But as I looked at Hunter, I saw a glimmer of something I hadn't seen before, protectiveness. It was as if, for the first time, he wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for me. The contract is more than just papers. Emma, he said, his voice unwavering, you're not his anymore. In that moment, I realized something profound. My marriage to Hunter had begun as a transaction. Something I had no choice in. But now, it was something else entirely. It was a promise, a bond between two people who had been broken, yet were trying to heal together. And though I couldn't yet fathom what my future held, I knew this. I wasn't going anywhere. Not without a fight, not without choosing this life for myself. I'm staying, I whispered, not just to him, but to myself. For the first time, I wasn't someone's pawn. I was Emma Montgomery. And I was no longer afraid. As the days passed, the world outside the walls of Hunter's estate began to blur, and I found myself torn between the woman I had been and the woman I was becoming. The fear that had once shackled me was slowly giving way to something else, something I had never known before, freedom. For the first time in my life, I was making my own choices, and they didn't belong to my father or to anyone else. One morning, I stood in the lavender fields behind the estate, the soft golden light of the setting sun casting a surreal glow over the blossoms. It felt like a dream, a place where I could finally breathe. And there, standing beside me, was Hunter. He wasn't the man who had once taken everything from me. He wasn't my captor. He was my partner, my equal. And in that moment, I realized I had never been more in love. Life was no longer a prison, but a world full of possibilities. The past, with all its pain and uncertainty, had been a chapter. Now, I was writing my own story. The love between us wasn't just about power or possession, it was about acceptance, understanding, and the quiet tenderness that had grown between us over time. We had both been broken, in different ways, but together, We had found something stronger. Something real. And as we watched our twin children run through the lavender, laughing and chasing butterflies, I knew that this was the life I had always dreamed of. Even if I hadn't known it until now. This was my happy ending. A beginning of freedom, love, and the unwavering belief that life always offers a second chance. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to stay updated with more life stories.